Hadley, I'd like to start off by asking you to tell us a bit about your experience of having anorexia starting at 14.
Right. So about a month after, or a few weeks after I turned 14, I was in school in the PE class, and I was sat next to a girl who I call Lizzie in the book, and she was very tiny. And I looked at her legs, which were much skinnier than mine, and I said, without really thinking about it, is it hard to buy clothes when you're so small? And she said, yes, I wish I was normal like you. And this just completely winded me. It completely spun me out. Normal to me meant average, no way to describe it, nothing, invisible. And I basically stopped eating that day. And within 3 months, I was in hospital for the first time. And all in all, I was admitted 9 times to hospital over a 3-year period.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. You talk about in the book about that being a trigger, but
Exactly.
you think there were deeper reasons, on reflection,
Mm.
about what was happening with you.
Oh yeah, I mean, it certainly wasn't that comment that made me anorexic. Anorexia, people never seem to understand this. Anorexia is not about wanting to be thin. It's about the person trying to say something that they are unable to articulate. It's about them trying to voice their unhappiness, their anger, their sense of shame, their fear, their loneliness. It almost invariably comes on before adolescence. So a lot of times it's bound up with fear of growing up, fear of becoming a woman, fear of sexuality and being sexualized. And these are often very difficult things for girls to articulate. It is mainly girls who get it. Of course, men and boys do get it too, but it is overwhelmingly suffered by girls and women. It's very hard for them to articulate this, and so they express it with their bodies.
And while it was happening, did you have any inkling of how sick it was making you, both psychologically and physically?
Well, the thing is, an anorexic doesn't want to be thin. She wants to look ill. So I wanted to look ill. And I did have some awareness, certainly at the beginning, when I first started cutting out food. So that right after that comment in PE, there was a part of me that was sort of watching what I was doing, skipping lunch, chucking my dinner under the table to the dog. That was in shock about this. It was like I'd split in two. There was the old well me and the new sick me. And as soon as I went into hospital, it just became all about the sick me. There was no well me left. But I was aware of, there was an awareness of how thin I looked. I couldn't picture it as a whole, but I loved, seeing bones appear, poking through my skin on my body, being able to circle various limbs with my fingers. So I definitely knew that. And I knew what I weighed, of course, at all times. But I didn't it's hard to say, like, yes, I knew I was sick, but I also wanted to be sick, so it's not like I was worried about it.
And can you remember a sort of lowest ebb for you?
So over the first year, I was admitted to the same hospital 3 times. And the psychiatrist I was under there, I call that one Hospital One, the psychiatrist I was under there said I needed to drop out of school in order to focus on my recovery. And something in me just refused to do that. That was very standard practice back then for teenagers who were anorexic. They were told to drop out of school. And I just refused. And as a result, he refused to treat me. So I left him, which was good because I never liked him anyway. But then I was under no supervision. And I was at this point going to a crammer in West London to try to catch up on the school year I'd missed. I'd missed my entire first year of GCSE. So I was trying to do my GCSEs in a year at this special crammer. And I was just really not eating at all. And I started having these really bad heart palpitations, which would lead to fainting fits. And that used to happen as I would, it could happen anywhere. It could have happened, it happened at school. It happened certainly when I would be walking home from school up the Cromwell Road. And it felt like having a little heart attack. And the truth was, my heart was, I was cannibalizing the muscles of my heart and not getting enough oxygen because I wasn't eating. And that was pretty bad. And at that point, my GP intervened and put me into a general hospital.
So this was before you went into the boarding school crammer. This was when you
Oh,
were
yes.
right.
Yes. So
Okay.
first I was in a day school crammer where I did my GCSEs. And then after I got out of hospital for the last time, I went off to a boarding school crammer to do my A levels in a year.
And what started off your recovery?
So I was in hospital for a further 2 years after those fainting fits. In first hospital 3, which was an NHS eating disorder ward in South London, and then hospital 4, which was a little bit further out in the suburbs. And I kept up my GCSEs or my studies, and I did my exams on the ward. And getting the grades was the first time when I phoned up my school and got my grades. That was the first time I thought maybe there is a future for me beyond hospital, which I really hadn't thought about at all. I just assumed this would be my life going in and out of hospital at that point. And then one day, not long after that, I was sat in the dining room where we all ate, all the patients ate our 3 meals and 3 snacks a day together. And I was sat opposite another patient, this 32-year-old woman, and she was very upset because she felt there was more butter on her toast than other people's. And this happened every single mealtime. Someone would get very, very distressed, feeling like they had the bigger portion, or they had more cheese or more grease or more butter than everyone else. Because anorexia is very competitive. We're all looking at each other, who's got the most, who's got the least, So she was crying, and the nurse was trying to comfort her. And I suddenly had this thought come into my head that said, I will not be having temper tantrums about toast when I'm 32 years old. Um, and it's not like everything changed then. That was my 8th admission. I did leave, and then I went back into hospital again for my 9th and final admission. But things did start to change then. The most significant thing for me, though, the contributory factor, was keeping up with my schoolwork. None of the other girls my age in hospital at that point had done that. And for all of them, the ones who I tracked down to interview for the book, they all feel it massively hampered their recovery, having dropped out of school.
Yes, because I think of you as a high achieving good girl at school.
Yeah.
So you did hang on to that.
Yes,
Yes.
and I understand that for some kids, and in general, and also for some girls, and for some girls with anorexia, school can exacerbate the anxiety. I totally understand that. And the thinking for a lot of the doctors, certainly back in the 90s, was they couldn't be distracted with anything else. They had to focus entirely on their recovery. But for me, I just knew that I needed something to leave hospital for. I mean, I don't know where that self-preservation came from, but I wasn't ready to totally give up, the outside. And also for me, I really did love school, so I didn't want to lose that. Um, but it changed everything, because it meant that when I left hospital for the last time, I then went off to this boarding crammer, which you mentioned, where I did my A levels in a year. So I was with other kids who, were not in an eating disorder ward, context. And then from there, I went to university, and that's when, I mean, I was still very ill in a lot of ways, but it was kind of no looking back at that point. I was now back on the highway of normality, basically.
And what role did therapy have in your treatment?
It was enormous. For my first hospital 1, there was that doctor who I mentioned who I didn't like, who I call Dr. R in the book, and he was a psychiatrist, and the therapy was very minimal. I mean, the thinking back then was that there was no point in really giving therapy to girls and women in hospital with anorexia, because they're too underweight and their brains aren't taking anything in. That mentality has changed a lot, as I learned when I was researching the book and talking to doctors working in eating disorders now. But he was not a good psychiatrist, and he has since had his medical license stripped for having, after I left him, having a relationship with a patient. So I left him, and then after that, I was under the care of my GP, and he found for me the wonderful psychiatrist Janet Treasure, who's based at the Maudsley, and she looked after me at Hospital 3 and Hospital 4, and she did the most important step, probably for another important step for my recovery, was she got me together with a therapist who I call JF in the book to maintain her anonymity. And she was the first therapist I had encountered during this whole experience who I couldn't outsmart and who totally understood me. She, like me, was American and obviously a woman, and Jewish as well, like me. And that somehow gave us a connection. I'm not saying you need to be in the same demographic as your therapist, but for me at that point, I felt she understood me, another American in London. And she, without a doubt, changed everything. It was her who insisted that I keep up with my schoolwork. She helped arrange with my school that an examiner come to the hospital and supervise me so I could do my GCSEs there, because I wasn't allowed to leave hospital to take my exams. Like, she very much kept me, on the road to recovery.
And what about, further on in your life? Has it been useful still to have?
Oh, totally. I still go to therapy. I love it. I don't know if I'm allowed to say my therapist's name. Maybe he wouldn't like it, but I do see a man now. I'm not saying I can only see women, but do see a man, and also he is Jewish, so maybe I do need to have biographical connections. And he is wonderful, and because when you recover from an eating disorder, certainly as I found, you're not all better. The emotions that were underlying it can still be there, and for me they mutated into problems with substance addiction, because I wasn't under any therapeutic guidance at that point, and that went on for a long time. And then I got in touch with my current therapist, Adam, and he has really helped me through that and helped me through the sort of turmoil of motherhood and all these other changes that have come into my life. He's just wonderful.
And do you feel there have been repercussions in your adult life of your anorexia?
Well, the one that bugs me the most is, so when I was anorexic, all my hair fell out and it's never really grown back properly. And that always bothers me. I feel like that is my karmic payback for having caused so much distress to my parents. Um, in terms of, in general, in my mentality, I think it's made me much more driven in a funny way, because I feel like I wasted so much time. There's so many days of just sitting around doing nothing in the hospital. And I know how life can just disappear, and I refuse to not do the things I want to achieve, basically. It
Mm.
has made me much more focused on what do you want to do, and don't get distracted with things that are a waste of time. Although I did get distracted with drugs for a long time, but it never came between me and work and trying to do the things I wanted to do.
What was it, an emotional struggle to write about all of this, to go back to thinking about that girl?
That wasn't hard, because my memories of hospital are so vivid that they're always there. I remember hospital, like I could describe everything about it: the rug, the beds, the lights, and the ceiling. I can remember a hospital more clearly than I can remember yesterday. So that's always, it's just there from my brain. The hard stuff was going back and finding some of the patients and interviewing them. And of course, quite a few of them have died. And I did know that, but writing about that was very sad. And in one instance, I interviewed the parents of one girl I was in hospital with who died afterwards, and that was very, very sad. But I'm glad I did that. I'm glad I've kind of memorialized her in this book, and her parents like that chapter. So that means a lot, because she was like, it's very easy to say this kind of stuff, but she was a really special person, and I want more people to know about her.
And how do you think the treatment of anorexia has changed since the 90s?
So I went back to hospital 4, and I've also spoken to other doctors in other hospitals, and they all say the same things, which is that it's become much more individualized. Um, when I was there, it was all about reward and punishment. So, you put on a certain amount of weight, you get a reward. Like, you're not watched in the shower, you're not watched on the toilet, you might be allowed outside for a bit. And if you lose weight, you lose those rewards. It's not quite that blunt and Victorian anymore. And also, the patients are given much more agency over choosing their food. It's not everybody has to eat what's in front of them, whether you like it or not. At Hospital 4, where I was, you can even have vegan meals, which would have been unthinkable when I was in hospital.
Mm.
Um, and also, when I was there, obsessive exercisers like myself, we just had to stop right away. And if you were caught jogging, or someone came across you in the lounge and you were jumping up and down, they would like forcibly like stop you. Whereas now it's much more about cutting back slowly, encouraging you to cut back. And same with making patients who make themselves sick, instead of just locking the toilets, which is what the nurses used to do. They try to help them cut back on making themselves sick, or wait for a bit longer after a meal. So it's much more about the individual. Another thing that's changed is there's a huge amount of awareness now about the possible crossover between autism and anorexia. This has been a theory for a while, that anorexia is a female form of autism, because the tests for autism were originally, as far as I was told by Kate Chanturia, who's kind of the expert on this subject in this country, the tests were originally formulated for little boys. And so little girls aren't necessarily diagnosed. And also little girls are better at mimicking social cues often than boys. And so they can mask their autism spectrum disorder for longer. And then when they get to puberty and, the social cues get more complicated and their body's changing, things sort of explode. And for some of them, their autism is expressed through anorexia. So a lot of the eating disorder wards are now autism friendly, which means the colors are more muted. There's not, there's less shouting. There's an autism friendly menu at one of the ones I went to, which is like much more bland food, nothing too spicy, nothing too salty, anything like that. Other doctors disagree with this, and they feel that you can't diagnose an anorexia because they have done tests on people with anorexia to see if they're autistic or have autism spectrum disorder. And other doctors say you can't do a test on someone with anorexia because often the symptoms of starvation can seem like autism, kind of the lack of empathy, cutting yourself off from the
Mm.
world, whispering, pulling your hair from your face. And I do interview one girl I was in hospital with, Geraldine, who's now about my age. And she did do all those things when we were in hospital. She whispered, she looked at the ground, she never made eye contact, and now she doesn't. So those were symptoms of starvation. She was not autistic.
Mm.
So it is a complicated thing. It's one of those things where it's not all or nothing. I'm sure some people with anorexia do have autism and some don't. It's,
Mm.
not
Mm.
one thing or the other.
And do you think anorexia still has the same power over young people today?
Well, apparently it does. I mean, the rates were going up, or the hospitalizations were going up, particularly during the pandemic, which is really not a surprise for me, because anorexia is often an expression of anxiety and a feeling like the world is out of control, whether that is about approaching adulthood or whether things in the outside world. And when the outside world feels so scary and nobody knows what's going on, like during the pandemic, it's much easier to shrink your world down and make it more manageable and just about how little can I eat today? How much weight will I lose tomorrow? How much exercise can I get in today? So it's like an OCD for a lot of people, and it certainly was for me. So it's not a surprise at all.
Have you seen the Dove ad that
About body
has just
positivity.
come out? No, it's about eating disorders.
Oh, really?
Have a look at it.
Okay.
It's only just come out. I think it's about 3 minutes long. I just came upon it on social media. But
Oh.
what about social media and um, eating disorders? What are your feelings there?
You
More
might be.
likely to get them going, or just more, the same sort of thing as it is for everything else,
Yeah,
good
I
and bad.
feel they're a lot like what fashion magazines were in the 90s, in that, they can make it harder to recover. And they can validate an eating disorder and also maybe, hide it for longer because suddenly, being very thin and food focused can seem like the norm. But they don't cause it. I mean, an eating disorder is caused by feelings within the patient that, things like social media or fashion magazines or, 500 years ago, religion can give the patient a cultural language through which to express their unhappiness. It used to be, a girl was so holy, she didn't eat. Now it's like a girl is such a perfectionist, she doesn't eat. A girl wants to look like a model, she doesn't eat. So they provide a cultural language in which to discuss it, but they don't cause it. Um, they can validate it, but they don't cause it.
Mm. And finally, you in your book you talk a bit about how gender dysphoria may be
Mhm.
in relationship to anorexia for
Yeah,
young women today.
yeah.
Would you
Um,
like
so
to explain that?
So I wasn't going to get on to gender dysphoria in the book, but then when I was in the middle of writing it, I saw a bunch of news stories that said, I think it was something like 74% of patients at GIDS, which is the only NHS gender clinic for children and young people in England and Wales, and it's actually now about to be shut down. 74% of the patients there were teenage girls, and this really stood out to me because at eating disorder clinics, the patients are generally 90 to 95% teenage girls. So I went off and interviewed a bunch of doctors, including 3 doctors who formerly worked at GIDS, as well as child analysts and neurospecialists. And they all said the same thing. I mean, there are some doctors who definitely disagree with this idea, and I quote them in the book, but others feel, particularly the ones who worked at GIDS, that the emotions that once were expressed for girls through anorexia are increasingly being expressed through gender dysphoria, namely a fear of becoming a woman, fear of growing up, fear of sex, a fear of their sexuality, and a fear of being sexualized. And that does make a lot of sense to me. And of course, I'm not saying all gender dysphoric teenage girls are actually anorexics, or all anorexics are gender dysphoric, or anything. It's never all or nothing. But as one of the doctors who was at JIDS, Anna Hutchinson, who now I believe works in adolescence at Great Ormond Street Hospital, she said to me, in every generation there's a symptom pool, and when you experience certain feelings, you go down to the symptom pool and find ways to express those feelings. So once it was anorexia, then it became bulimia, then it became cutting, and now there's gender dysphoria. It's a kind of separation from one's body and a rejection of one's body, and a belief that if you change your body, you will be happy and you will be a different person. Um, and I know that gender is a very sensitive subject, but I do also think there's something slightly odd about grouping together so many different types of people who are having gender dysphoria. For example, an adult male who feels that his biological sex doesn't reflect his true gender is obviously extremely different from a anxious, unhappy teenage girl or a confused child. And I think we need to sort of maybe separate these things out. Gender has become a cultural conversation that people can use to express different things. Those things can be extremely different from group to group, and of course from person to person.
That's great. Thanks very much, Hadley. I think it's a fabulous book, and well done for writing it.
Thank you, Louise. I really appreciate it.